The cab pulled up to the curb and I sat there for a moment, just looking at the house through the window. It was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd built it up too big in my head over the years. The way you do with things you've been away from too long. A pale yellow colonial on a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio. The shutters were still white. The oak tree in the front yard had gotten enormous. My daughter had been 7 years old when we planted that tree together. Her little hands patting the dirt around the roots while I held the sapling steady. She was 31 now. I paid the driver, grabbed my bag, and stood on the sidewalk. 7 years. I'd been in Germany for 7 years working as a project consultant for a manufacturing firm. Good money, honest work. The kind of arrangement that made sense when it started and somehow just kept going. I told myself every year that I'd come back more often. I told myself a lot of things. The flight had landed at 6 in the morning, and I'd gone straight through a hotel, slept a few hours, then called a cab. I hadn't told my daughter I was coming. I wanted to surprise her. I had this picture in my head. She'd open the door, see me standing there, and throw her arms around me the way she used to when she was small. I walked up the front path and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. I could hear a television inside, low volume. Someone was home. The door opened about 4 inches, stopped by a chain, and a face I didn't recognize looked out at me. A woman, maybe late 50s. Hard eyes. She looked me up and down the way people look at someone they've already decided they don't like. "We don't want any," she said, and started to close the door. "I'm looking for my daughter," I said. "This is her house. My name is Arthur Bellman. Her name is Natalie." The woman's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind her eyes. "She's busy," she said. "You can call first next time." "I just flew in from Frankfurt," I said. "I haven't seen my daughter in 14 months. Please tell her I'm here." There was a long pause. Then the chain rattled and the door opened. I walked into my daughter's house and I stopped moving. Natalie was on her knees at the far end of the hallway, scrubbing the baseboards with a brush. She was wearing an oversized gray t-shirt that was damp with sweat at the collar, old sweatpants, and a pair of rubber gloves that went up to her elbows. Her hair was pulled back in a tight knot. She looks thin, not slim. Thin the way people get when they're not eating right, or not sleeping right, or both. She looked up and saw me, and for a second her face did exactly what I'd imagined. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened and something lit up behind her expression. Then she looked at the woman behind me, and that light went out. "Dad," she said, and her voice was careful. Measured. Like she was choosing each word the way you choose your footing on ice. "This is a surprise." "It's supposed to be," I said. I looked at the bucket of cleaning supplies next to her. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes. I looked at the thin line of her wrists above the rubber gloves. "What are you doing?" "Just cleaning," she said, and stood up, pulling the gloves off. The woman behind me, I still didn't know her name, made a noise that wasn't quite a word. Natalie's eyes flicked to her. "My father-in-law's mother is visiting," Natalie said to me quietly. "Can we maybe—" "She hasn't finished the hallway," the woman said. I turned around slowly. "I'm sorry," I said. "The hallway floors. She hasn't finished them." I looked at this woman for a long moment. Then I picked up my bag from where I'd set it down, put my hand on my daughter's shoulder, and said, "We're going to sit down and talk. The hallway can wait." The woman stiffened, but something in my voice must have landed the right way, or maybe the wrong way, depending on who you were, because she didn't push it further. She walked back toward the living room, and I steered Natalie toward the kitchen. That was the first 10 minutes. By the end of the day, I understood I hadn't walked in on a bad afternoon. I had walked in on the last 3 years of my daughter's life. Natalie had met her husband, Scott Vance, 4 years ago at a work event. He was charming. She'd told me about him over video calls. I remembered the particular brightness in her voice when she talked about him. And I remembered being happy for her. They'd gotten married after 8 months, which was fast, but Natalie had always trusted her instincts, and her instincts had usually been right. The house was hers. I'd helped her buy it years before all of this, back when property in that part of Dayton was still reasonable. It was in her name. I'd made sure of that. Scott had moved in after the wedding. His mother, Beverly, that was her name, Beverly Vance, had followed about 4 months later for what was supposed to be a temporary visit while her apartment situation sorted itself out. That was 3 years ago. Beverly was still there. So was Scott's younger brother, a 24-year-old named Troy, who had apparently decided that steady employment was optional. I sat across from Natalie at her own kitchen table, and I watched her pour coffee with shaking hands, and I started asking questions. It took a while. She'd gotten good at minimizing things the way people do when they've been telling themselves something is normal for long enough. But I kept asking, quietly, patiently, the way I'd learned to ask things over 40 years of working with people who didn't always want to say what was actually happening. By the third cup of coffee, I had the shape of it. Beverly ran the house. She decided what got cleaned, when, and by whom. She decided what got cooked and whether it was done right. She criticized everything Natalie did in front of her own husband, and Scott didn't correct her. When Natalie pushed back, Scott would get cold and withdrawn for days, and Natalie had learned that the withdrawal was worse than the criticism, so she'd stopped pushing back. Troy ate their food, used their utilities, brought his friends over at all hours, and when Natalie once asked Scott to talk to his brother about it, Scott had told her she was being selfish. "He's family," Natalie said, repeating it the way she'd been told it. "That's what he always says. He's family." "Your family," I said. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she told me the other part, the part she'd been building up to since I sat down. About 14 months ago, Natalie had become pregnant. She and Scott hadn't been trying. Not exactly, but she was glad. She thought maybe a baby would. She trailed off there, and I understood what she'd been hoping without her having to finish the sentence. She thought a baby might change things. Bring Scott closer. Give her something of her own in that house. The pregnancy was difficult. She had severe morning sickness that lasted well past the first trimester. She was exhausted in a way she hadn't experienced before. The kind that lives in your bones. Beverly told her she was being dramatic. Scott started working longer hours. By the time she was 7 months along, she was managing the house, cooking, cleaning, and managing Beverly's opinions about all of it, while Troy sat in the living room watching television. She gave birth to a daughter. They named her Lily, and then the postpartum depression came down on Natalie like a wall. She described it to me carefully, trying to find words for something that didn't translate easily. She said she loved Lily from the first second. She needed me to know that. She said it twice, but that there was something wrong with the wiring between what she felt and how she could function. She would sit and hold the baby and love her completely and be unable to get up off the chair. She would go whole days without eating. She would lose hours. She saw a doctor. She got a diagnosis. She started medication. And then something happened that I didn't understand at first when she told me. She said Scott had been handling the bills. She said she'd asked him to help with the finances during the worst months because she genuinely couldn't focus well enough to manage them reliably. She trusted him. Of course she'd trusted him. He was her husband. She said the medication made her foggy, especially in the first months. She said there were forms she didn't remember signing. She said she'd asked Scott about them later, and he'd said they were refinancing paperwork, standard stuff. She didn't need to worry. She stopped talking. She was looking at her hands. "Natalie," I said. "The house might not be in my name anymore," she said. I'm not sure, but I think he might have changed something. He keeps talking about it as his house now. He says Beverly has a right to be here because it's his house. And when I tried to look it up at the county recorder's office, Scott got very angry. She finally looked at me. "I don't actually know what I signed, Dad." That night, I lay on the pull-out couch in Natalie's small home office. Beverly had the guest room. That was just how things were, apparently. And I stared at the ceiling and thought, I am 63 years old. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, and I have learned that anger by itself does not accomplish anything. Anger is a fuel. The question is what you build with it. In the morning, I called an attorney. Her name was Margaret Osei, and a colleague had recommended her years ago when I'd needed estate planning help. I explained the situation over the phone. She told me to come in. I drove Natalie to that appointment. Beverly made a comment when we left about the floors still needing to be mopped, and I looked at her for a moment. And then I said very pleasantly, "The floors will still be here when we get back." And I walked out. Margaret was thorough. She explained what she'd need to look into. She asked Natalie detailed questions about the timeline, when the postpartum depression had been diagnosed, what medications she'd been on, what month she believed the paperwork had been handled, whether she had copies of anything. Natalie didn't have copies of much, but she had her medical records, and she authorized Margaret to obtain the county property records. It took Margaret 4 days. She called me on a Thursday morning. She had the property records. She also had, through a contact at Natalie's former OB practice, the clinical notes from that period, which required Natalie's written consent to access, which Natalie had given. The deed transfer had been executed 11 months ago. Scott had moved the house out of Natalie's name and into a joint LLC that he controlled. Natalie's signature was on the documents. The date on those documents was February 14th. Margaret pulled up the medical records for that same period. On February 14th, Natalie's psychiatrist had documented a severe dissociative episode. The clinical notes read that the patient was disoriented, minimally responsive to verbal communication, and unable to reliably process or retain information. Her medication had been adjusted to the maximum therapeutic dose 3 days prior, and she was in the middle of what her doctor described as an acute phase. She couldn't have given informed consent on that date, Margaret said. Legally or practically. I sat with that for a moment. What are our options? I said. Margaret laid them out. It would not be simple or fast. There would be a civil proceeding to challenge the validity of the transfer on grounds of incapacity. There might be criminal exposure for Scott, depending on how a DA chose to look at it. The LLC structure would need to be examined. This was going to take months and it was going to cost money. I'm not going anywhere, I said, and money isn't the obstacle. Then we have a case, she said. I moved out of Natalie's home office and into a hotel, not because I was giving up proximity. I was at the house every day, but because I needed a space where I could think clearly and make phone calls without anyone in that household knowing what I was doing. Beverly noticed my absence immediately and told Scott, who told Natalie, who called me with tension in her voice and asked if I was leaving. I'm not leaving, I said. I'll be there in the morning. I was there in the morning. I brought Lily to the park while Natalie rested. I pushed my granddaughter on the swings and thought about the oak tree in the front yard and about all the years I had spent telling myself that distance was temporary, that I would make it right later, that Natalie was fine. She had not been fine. A man cannot fix time. What I had learned over 63 years was that you do the next thing that is in front of you, the next right thing as clearly as you can see it. I found a family therapist and asked Natalie if she would be willing to go. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I sat down with Scott one evening when Beverly and Troy were out. I had thought carefully about how to approach that conversation. Scott was 36 years old, not unintelligent, and he clearly believed that what he had done was justified, or at least defensible. People who have crossed a line and kept walking usually believe this. I told him I knew about the deed transfer. I told him the date. I told him what Natalie's medical records said about that date. He went very still. That was her idea, he said finally. It wasn't, I said, and you know it wasn't. And we both know what the records say. She was confused. I was trying to protect the assets, Scott. I kept my voice level. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm telling you that I have legal counsel. And I'm telling you what I have legal counsel. And I'm telling you what comes next. That's all. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you where we are. He didn't say anything. Natalie and Lily are going to be fine, I said. The only question is how we get there. He looked at me for a long time. Then he got up and left the room. I don't know what I expected from that conversation. I didn't expect it to be easy. It wasn't. What happened next was not what I planned. About 2 weeks after I arrived, I came to the house in the morning and found Natalie standing on the front porch with Lily in her arms and a diaper bag over her shoulder. Her face was white. He changed the locks, she said. I looked at the door. New hardware, still with the installation stickers on it. I called Margaret immediately. She called Scott's number. He didn't answer. She left a message that I will simply describe as extremely clear. Then I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. Homeowner locked out of her own residence while title dispute was pending. Documentation of ownership available. An officer came out, reviewed what Margaret faxed over within the hour, and informed Scott, who eventually opened the door, that locking a resident out of a property she had documented legal interest in was not something he was entitled to do regardless of what the deed currently said. Beverly came out onto the porch during this and told the officer that it was her son's house and we were trespassing. The officer was very patient with her. I was less patient, but I kept it internal. Natalie went back inside. I stayed on the porch. Lily fell asleep against her mother's shoulder. The civil proceedings took 4 months. Margaret was meticulous. The medical evidence was the spine of the case, the documented incapacity, the timing, the specificity of the clinical notes. Natalie's therapist provided a supporting statement. Margaret also uncovered something during discovery that we hadn't initially known. Scott had taken out a second mortgage on the property through the LLC 6 months after the transfer, drawing out equity that Natalie had spent years building. The judge voided the deed transfer on grounds of incapacity at the time of signing. She also voided the second mortgage, ordered Scott to repay the drawn equity with interest, and referred the matter to the county DA's office for review of potential financial exploitation charges. Scott's attorney managed to reach a settlement before criminal charges were filed. I will not describe the terms in detail except to say that they were sufficient. Natalie's name went back on the deed. The financial damage was compensated. Scott and Beverly and Troy vacated the property. It is strange leaving a marriage. I don't mean the legal part, I mean the emotional geography of it. Natalie moved through those months with a steadiness that I found remarkable, and a sadness that I found heartbreaking. She wasn't angry mostly, or rather, she had already used up a lot of the anger during the 3 years before I arrived, alone, with no one to direct it at because she hadn't fully understood yet what was being done to her. The therapist was good. Natalie went twice a week. I went with her twice when she asked me to, and those were hard sessions and useful ones. At one point, the therapist asked me gently how I had been able to stay away so long without knowing something was wrong. I didn't have a satisfying answer. I had the video calls and the careful voice my daughter had learned to use, had the distance. I had the work that kept expanding to fill the space I gave it. I had the very human ability to see what you want to see when someone you love tells you everything is fine. I should have come back more, I said. Yes, Natalie said. Not to hurt me, just because it was true. Lily started walking while all of this was happening. She took her first steps in the hallway, the same hallway where I'd first seen Natalie on her knees with a scrub brush, and she wobbled and sat down hard and laughed at herself. Natalie was there. I was there. We both started laughing too. Those moments are not small things. I know that now better than I did before. I did not go back to Germany. I had been planning to return for another contract cycle. 18 more months, good money, familiar work. I had the flights booked before I landed in Dayton. I cancelled them from my hotel room on the 4th night, after Natalie told me about the documents she didn't remember signing. It wasn't a dramatic decision. I didn't feel like I was making a sacrifice. I felt like I was finally paying attention. I rented an apartment 12 minutes from Natalie's house. I got a part-time consulting role that I could do remotely, Enough to keep me occupied and out of my daughter's business in the way that parents can sometimes make themselves too present when they're trying to compensate for being absent. I tried to be helpful without being intrusive. I tried to be there without taking over. Some days I got the balance right. Some days I didn't. Natalie repainted the front bedroom, the one Beverly had occupied. A soft green that she said Lily seemed to like. She planted a small garden in the backyard. Tomatoes, basil, a few things she'd always meant to try. She adopted a dog, a 3-year-old beagle mix named Chester, who knocked things over and ate one of her good shoes and took to sleeping across Natalie's feet every night. She started sleeping through the night again. That took a while, but it came. There is a photograph on her kitchen counter now. It is of me and Lily and Natalie in the backyard on an afternoon last October, the light coming sideways through the trees the way it does in fall in Ohio. Lily is holding a tomato she pulled off the vine herself, holding it up like she'd discovered it. Natalie is laughing. I am looking at the two of them, and the expression on my face is one I barely recognize. Not because it's foreign, but because I had forgotten it was possible to feel something that clearly. I think about what this story cost. The years I wasn't there. The 3 years Natalie spent navigating something she shouldn't have had to navigate alone. The months of legal proceedings and the slow work of rebuilding. I don't have a clean lesson to offer. I'm not sure life gives you those. What I have is this. I came back. Late, but I came back, and I stayed. Lily calls me Pop. I don't know where she got it. We didn't teach her that word. One morning she just looked at me and said it, clear as anything, and Natalie and I both went quiet. Pop. I'll take it. If there is one thing I would say to anyone listening who has people they love at a distance, not just miles, but the emotional distance that grows when you let too much time pass without really looking, it's this. Don't wait for a reason to come home. Don't wait until something goes wrong. I waited. I had reasons. Every one of them felt real at the time. None of them were worth what they cost. I've been turning this over in my mind for months now, trying to find the honest version of what happened. Not the version where I'm the hero, but the real one. The real one starts with me being gone. I made a choice 7 years ago to take a contract overseas because the money was good and the work was familiar, and I told myself Natalie was grown, she was capable, she didn't need me hovering. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth is that it was also easier to be busy, easier to let the distance become routine, easier to take her word for it on those video calls when she said everything was fine, because I wanted to believe her, and believing her cost me nothing. What I understand now, and this is the part that stays with me, is that the people who take advantage of someone don't usually announce themselves. Scott didn't walk into Natalie's life looking like a threat. He looked like a good thing. The control came slowly. The way water gets into a foundation, quietly, over time, through the smallest cracks. By the time Natalie could see the full shape of what was happening, she'd been inside it long enough that it had started to feel normal. That's not weakness. That's what sustained manipulation does to a person. It redefines the edges of what's acceptable, one small shift at a time. And I was 7 time zones away, not looking closely enough to notice the edges had moved. There's a version of this story where I arrive earlier and none of the worst of it happens. I don't know if that version exists. I know that choices compound. Mine did. So did Scott's. So did Natalie's. In the sense that every day she stayed and kept going and kept herself together for Lily was a choice that required something real from her. Something I don't think I fully appreciated until I sat across from her at her own kitchen table and watched her try to tell me the truth without falling apart. Natalie showed me something I hadn't expected, that the people who have been carrying the most, alone for the longest, are often the last ones to ask for help. Not because they're proud, though sometimes that too, but because they've had to become so self-sufficient out of necessity that asking starts to feel like a kind of defeat. Part of what I had to learn was how to be present without making her feel like she needed to manage my reaction on top of everything else she was managing. That took effort. It took me getting it wrong a few times first. What I believe after all of this is simple and not simple at the same time. The choices we make about where we put our attention are moral choices, even when they don't look like it. Deciding to be somewhere, really somewhere, not just geographically present, but actually paying attention, is not a passive thing. It requires something from you. And the absence of that attention, when it goes on long enough, creates space that other things move into. I'm not saying that makes what Scott did my fault. It doesn't. What he did was his choice and his responsibility, and the consequences were his to carry. But I had my own accounting to do. I did it. I'm still doing it. Lily said my name for the first time on a Tuesday morning in November, standing in a patch of sunlight in the kitchen doorway. She looked right at me when she said it, like she'd been practicing, like she'd decided I was worth naming. I'm staying.